Okay, as folks continue to join us, I will get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format in which we strive to bring you the authors we all love to our politics and prose community. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. You can ask a question by using the Q&A feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's question, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. I will be dropping a link in the chat to purchase the Ascent of Information, Books, Bits, Genes, Machines, and Life's Unending Algorithm. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website. We are delighted to offer closed captioning. Just look for the CC or live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Caleb Scharf is the award-winning author of The Zoomable Universe, The Copernicus Complex, and Gravity's Engines, and the director of the Columbia Astrobiology Center. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Scientific American, Nautilus, and Nature, among other publications. He lives in New York City. Scharf will be in conversation with David Grinspoon. Grinspoon is a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute. His research focuses on comparative planetology, with a focus on climate evolution on Earth-like planets and implications for habitability. His most recent book is Chasing New Horizons, Inside the Epic First Mission to Pluto. His book, Lonely Planets, The Natural Philosophy of Alien Life, won the 2004 PEN Literary Award for Nonfiction. His book, Earth in Human Hands, Shaping Our Planet's Future, was an NPR Science Friday Best Book of 2016. Grinspoon was appointed chair in astrobiology for 2012-2013 and is currently an adjunct professor of astrophysical and planetary science at the University of Colorado. Please join me in welcoming them both to PNP Live. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to run this like we were at the bookstore, which we all are, at least virtually. So Caleb Scharf will talk for a while, tell us about the Ascent of Information, and then he and I will have a bit of dialogue, and then we will open it up to your questions. So please remember, and during the talk, if things occur to you, just type them out in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can before we end. So take it away, Caleb.
Well, thank you so much, David. And it's nice to be here, even though virtual. And David and I were just chatting beforehand that, in fact, the first time we met physically was at Politics and Prose a number of years ago. So I guess this is the second best thing. So thank you so much for all of the introductions. I'm going to actually use a few visuals, and so let me get that rolling here. These visuals, it's a short little slideshow. Hopefully that's coming up for everyone. Just to give you a sense of what this book is about, because this book is about some pretty big, tough, challenging topics in science and technology. And to begin with, I just want to give you a sense of where this all starts. So it starts with an observation about us as a species. We do something kind of unique and interesting in that we generate and utilize and propagate all of this information that's not encoded in our DNA. It's not stuff that we can inherit from our parents biologically, but we can certainly inherit information from other members of our species throughout time. And we've been doing this for a long while. It goes back to some of the first visual representations of the world around us in these beautiful cave paintings from 30, 40, even more, 30, 40,000 years ago, even further back in time. We've been taking experience of the world and documenting it and converting it into information in a variety of forms. We do this in the earliest kinds of symbolic representation of language. So for example, here's cuneiform from ancient Mesopotamia. We've also had some really inventive and creative ways of storing and utilizing information. These are quipu from South America. These are knotted threads and cords that were used as a means of documenting numbers, but also perhaps performing calculations and even storing other forms of information, perhaps even music and so on. And of course, we've moved to alphabets more familiar to most of us, at least in the West, in ancient Greek and other languages. And we've also utilized the storage of information, the externalization of information to record things like music. It's not just direct human language. It's all manner of creative aspects of our lives have been stored in information that follows us through time, but is not encoded in our DNA. And of course, now we live in a time of extraordinary growth in digital information. We're even moving to a place where we might be to encode more and more information in quantum computing. So this little figure here is just a set of quantum logic symbolizations. And we instantiate information in pretty much everything we can get our sticky little hands on. And I feel like this needs a name. And so in the book, I call it the data ohm. And a way to think about the data ohm is much like a genome or a microbiome. It's a thing, an ohm, an all-encompassing quantity or entity that contains all of this information that our species generates and utilizes and propagates through time. And looking at the world this way is really interesting. And a major part of Ascent of Information is exploration of what this all means, what the implications of the data ohm are for us as a species. So an immediate observation, especially in today's world, is that the data ohm is this vast restructuring of matter and the way that energy is transformed in service of information. We have microelectronics, we have, of course, things like libraries, which are themselves, I would say, a part of the data ohm. They are structures that that themselves have an informational version in architectural drawings and in people's conceptions of these buildings, but they're also there in service of books, in service of human knowledge, in service of information. Of course, we have communication systems that now extend even beyond the surface of our planet in satellites and our more connected world. There's a massive restructuring of matter. And this intrigued me when I started out thinking about writing the book. And I wanted to explore this and understand it better because it seemed to me there's an aspect of our existence that we perhaps hadn't quite understood. We hadn't perhaps quite articulated in a way that enabled greater insight to what's really going on here on Earth. And that seems really important because the data ohm, especially today, is extraordinarily burdensome. In some ways, it's always been burdensome, and one could discuss the production of books and so on over human history. And it's a significant part of our sort of energetic output goes into supporting the data ohm. But today, it's particularly obvious. So for instance, every year at the moment, and this is a number that grows also every year, we generate roughly 2,000 exabytes of data. That may not mean terribly much to you. An exabyte is something like a million terabytes. It's an enormous number, but to put it in some kind of graspable context, that's 400 times more data than represented by all the words ever spoken by every human being that has ever lived. In other words, every day we produce at least as much data as is contained in all the words that have ever been spoken by every human being that has ever lived across the last 200,000 years since Homo sapiens emerged on this planet. And it's an extraordinary quantity of data and information. And as we all know, it's not all obviously useful. You know, a lot of that data is pictures of our cat, or what we had for lunch, or it's fleeting information about the weather or the traffic patterns, or it's, troll arguments on Facebook or Twitter, and so on and so on and so on. But it's all being generated, and the vast majority of it remains in the environment. It sticks around. It doesn't go away. It goes into cloud servers. It goes onto flash drives. It goes into your smartphone and your computers and so on. And it is a tremendous burden on the planet. And while it's still not as large a burden as sort of our more conventional industrial complex and our methods of transportation, it's growing. And again, this is just one example of this growth in our data ohm. So sometime by perhaps 2040, or even sooner than that, if our current trajectory in the growth of computing and information storage keeps going the way it is, it will actually require as much energy as we produce in total in terms of electrical production for our entire civilization at the moment, which is around 20 terawatts of power. So in 20 or so years, it means that our informational world, just our computation and data storage, will take up an amount of energy, or an energy flow equivalent to something like 20% of Earth's total biosphere power budget. Now, evaluating the Earth's biosphere power budget is a little tricky, but roughly speaking, it's of the order of 100 terawatts of power of energy flow required for all the biology on the planet to keep on functioning, for all the chemical reactions and so on to occur. So this is pretty shocking. And it raises an obvious question, so why is this really happening? And parochially, we look at it and say, well, it's because of commercial interests. It's because we like doing this. We like having pictures of our cat that we can access all the time, and so on and so on. But perhaps there's something else going on here. And that is a central part of what the Ascent of Information explores. Is why is this really happening? Is there a grander perspective here that gives us insight as to why we're doing this, especially if it is detrimental to us, if it is modifying our planetary environment because of this energy use and all the inefficiencies in that, pumping CO2 into the atmosphere and so on and so on. Why would we do that apart from just human stupidity? Is there something else going on? And the conclusion that I reach in the book, through a variety of fairly carefully assembled arguments, there's no one thing that gives this all away, but if you look at the various threads through things like physics, thermodynamics, information theory, biological evolution, computation, machine learning, all these things, even neuroscience, you get to a point where there's, I think, a clear indication that there really is something deeper at play here. Now, obviously, I can't go into that in enormous detail right now, but to give you just a sense of that, part of it comes from realizing that we actually already have a sort of information-centric or information-centered picture of how life itself works, how biological life works. So we talk about things like selfish genes. Okay, we can think about individual genes encoded in molecules as units of natural selection, as the things that natural selection ultimately acts on. And in that picture, genes are just little information carriers. They carry information for algorithms, if you will, algorithms that will build things like proteins and perform other functions for living organisms. So in fact, we already have a sense of the inner workings of biological life centered on the notion of information that just keeps propagating itself through time. Evolution doesn't have a plan particularly. What happens with evolution is stuff that works keeps existing. And so more of it will exist in the future. And that matches very well some of our deeper understanding about information and the nature of information flow in the world. So let me get to the more outrageous parts of this. So an outrageous conclusion that one might draw from all of this is that perhaps we're being much too parochial in thinking about the nature of life, and indeed thinking about the nature of this data ohm. Right? I've suggested that this data ohm is this big sort of mush of our information that sort of coexists with us, but I haven't really said that it's interacting with us in anything more than an inert fashion. But I think that may be wrong. I think, in fact, and this is a very provocative and outrageous kind of thing to say, that what we may be in the midst of is a planet that actually has more than one kind of living system in existence. That other living system would be represented by the data ohm. So we are represented by a genome. This metal world, if you will, of information and machines is represented by the data ohm. They obey, these two systems will obey the same underlying principles, kind of principles that we've been learning about for biological life for decades now, actually with the nature of DNA and genes and the propagation of those genes and how that information moves through time and through the world. Now, these two systems are highly dependent on each other. We can't imagine the data ohm existing without humans, right? It really came from us in the first place. But equally, more and more, it's very hard to imagine humans without their data ohm, without that information to support them. It's been an incredible boon to us as a species. It's enabled us to build on our knowledge, to inform ourselves through generation after generation. Everything you do is in principle going to be important, or at least there for subsequent generations to make use of. So perhaps we aren't what we thought we were. That in fact, we're not just humans per se, but much like we are humans in a microbiome, all the microbial entities that we know are so essential for our survival, both as individuals and as a species, that exist in a symbiotic relationship with us. Perhaps we are human data ohm symbiote. Perhaps biological human can't exist without its externalized information in this form. And that's really interesting because in symbiotic relationships in the natural world, the interests of the parties in that symbiotic relationship are not always aligned. Sometimes what's good for one is not good for the other. And we see that in things like the microbiome and the human health. But it's also pretty evident, and from what I've just talked about as well, that this may be true for humans and data ohm. From the point of view of the data ohm, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok are fabulous things because they grow it. They create greater opportunity for information to exist in the world and to inhabit new niches. But as we know, not only may it be detrimental to our planetary environment because we have to keep coming up with ways to provide energy to support all of that, it can be very detrimental to our social cohesion. We have false information. We're also spending our time looking at those cat pictures. I really shouldn't be bad on cat pictures. I apologize. I'm not against cat pictures per se. It's an easy example. That time occupied with that instead of doing other things is arguably not the healthiest thing for our biological selves. So this could be an example of the tension that may exist between symbiotes, between things in a symbiotic relationship. In other words, the data ohm may govern us as much as we govern it, and not in a trivial way. This is in a deep way rooted in the fundamentals of that phenomena that we call life, perhaps. So just to bring this to a close with another provocative statement, if all of this is a valid description of what's going on in our world, a valid way of looking at our existence and sort of recalibrating what we think we are, this also has things to tell us about ideas like transcendence or technological singularities. A lot of futurists love these things. The idea of transcendence is that maybe we're approaching a point where we can upload ourselves into machines, we can become something new, or technological singularities where our machines and our machine learning and artificial intelligences become sufficiently sophisticated that one day we wake up and they've just taken over. They've just shot off to some new place of extreme intelligence and they now dominate the world. Those ideas have been around for a while, and we always look at them as happening in the future. But what I think may be true is that we're sort of missing the point. We're missing what's right under our noses, that actually on the planet Earth, transcendence of some form actually happened 200,000 years ago with the emergence of Homo sapiens as a distinct species. And we've been living inside that ever since, because there's really no other species on Earth that does what we have done, that has generated this dataome. And as a final comment on this, where do we go with all of this? If this is a useful way to think about ourselves and the nature of our existence on the planet, what do we do with it? Well, my feeling about this, and I'd be interested to hear about David's thoughts on this as well, because he's thought so deeply about the nature of humans and the planet that we inhabit, is that if we want to improve our life and improve the state of things for all life on this planet, you kind of need to understand what you are. It's like if you want to get therapy, it's good to sort of understand what you are. And I have a little joke about this where I say, well, okay, so I went to the doctor and said to the doctor, you know, it's crazy. Every time I have a meal, my mouth is on fire. And the doctor looks at me and says, well, you know that you're an anteater, right? So if you don't know you're an anteater, you're going to be very puzzled about why your mouth is on fire every time you eat those nice sort of stinging ants. But if you have a better understanding, you can seek help. You can seek, excuse me, you can seek, I apologize, my computer was leaping to something else. See, the dataome is taking me over as well. It reached out and grabbed me. But you know, by having a better understanding of what's actually going on, if we are in this place of tension between us and our dataome, maybe there are clues there as to how we can actually do better, and actually find the right therapy for ourselves and our planet. So thank you very much. I'll stop here before the dataome does anything else to me.
All right.
Come back to the conversation.
Thank you, Caleb. That was a wonderful and very provocative presentation. And for those of you in the audience, I can tell you I've read the book, and it's all like that. It's full of ideas that really challenge you to think in new ways about really what human beings are and what we're doing on this planet, which of course is a very useful thing. It's the best thing a book can do, because we need new ways of thinking about ourselves on this planet right now. So it's a contribution. So one thing I'm wondering about, and I know you touch on this a bit more in the book, but I think it would be interesting to discuss. When we think about, you know, the situation of humans on Earth and the problems we're facing now, facing the future, obviously a big one, maybe the big one that people are aware of or need to be aware of, is climate change. So how would, sort of from the perspective of the dataome, how would you describe the problem of climate change? And then is there anything that, you know, how can that help us as far as what we need to do, say, in the next century to come to grips with our role on this planet with regard to energy and climate and so forth?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And it's something I definitely thought about and articulate a little bit in the book. Yes, I think, you know, on the face of it, one could look at all of our technological developments, utilization of energy from the environment, whether it's burning hydrocarbons or building solar panels or burning coal or whatever, as being directly influenced by the data ohm. It's not all explicitly in support of external information, but I would argue that if you really analyze it, you will find a thread leading you back to the data ohm. Even if we're thinking about our cars, for example, or automobiles, right? So a car actually makes a significant contribution to the data ohm. It's a very complex piece of machinery, and it therefore is a participant in this symbiosis just as much as we are. It's, in some ways, it's closer to the data ohm than we are because it is a machine. So I would argue that there's really very little separation between the vast technological world, the industrial complexes that we construct, and the data ohm itself. Those needs are very much aligned, much more than they may be aligned with our biological needs. And so the current exponential growth in how much effort we have to put into supporting the data ohm, as I talked about in my slides, is an indicator of where this is headed. I think we're perhaps in a period right now where it's not quite there yet. We're doing still plenty of damage by just sort of seemingly conventional ways of doing things, of burning hydrocarbons, of driving cars, of smelting minerals and so on. But that is being added to constantly because of informational world. And it's sort of ironic. We're getting a little bit more savvy about maybe I should have a solar panel, maybe I should have a windmill, maybe I should have more efficient devices and so on. But at the same time, this crazy exponential growth is going on almost entirely in support of information, of data. So what do we do with that? Well, I think there's a couple of things. One I sort of alluded to at the end of what I was saying, that you can't seek therapy unless you have some idea of what you are. That's a little vague, but an example might be that we begin to try to look at information in the same way that we look at energy or carbon. It's kind of like a natural resource. It's a restructuring of matter into a very specific form, but so too is something like oxygen. Right? Oxygen has been, the atoms of oxygen that are put together to make an oxygen molecule or atmosphere could be in other things to start with. And then there's a mechanism, a biological mechanism that restructures that specific kind of matter, the element of oxygen, to make atmospheric oxygen. So maybe information is more like a natural resource than we've thought about it. Right? We think of it as a secondary thing, an outcome, but maybe it's not. And in fact, if information is something at the root of the phenomenon of life in the first place, then it kind of points to that information, although it sounds sort of vague and strange, is a natural resource. It's akin to energy. It's a restructuring of matter. And therefore, perhaps we have to, I wouldn't say tax information, because that feels really bad, right? But be aware that anything we do in service of information is going to be different than, for example, picking up an apple and eating it, in terms of the burden it places on the planet. So perhaps as well as having monitors of sort of carbon units and things like that, we need some way of monitoring informational use, and perhaps the quality of information as well. And again, I'm going to mention cat videos and pictures. I'm not against cats, but it's an example of something that does feel a little bit trivial, right? For the betterment of humanity, do those cat videos really get us somewhere? And it's not clear. That may be grossly unfair. In the future, we'll suddenly discover that actually the solution to everything was in all the cat videos, right? But the interesting thing is we have ways of quantifying informational content. We have what's called information theory, coming from computation, computer science, and physics. But we also understand that information is used for survival. And information for survival is information that tells you things about the world around you that inform your decisions. And so, there are ways of quantifying the quality of information, how useful information really is, the meaning of information. Perhaps we could apply some of that in a way that, instead of my iPhone every week tells me how much screen time I've had and what I was doing. Well, maybe it could also list, this is your informational footprint. This is how much you put into the cloud. This is how much you downloaded. This is the quality of the things that you generated. There are actually ways we could calculate that. And maybe that would be a beginning. It would be a very strange change to make, but it might be an important thing to do.
Yeah, it'd be interesting because we're all very sort of obsessed with our carbon footprints now. What about our sort of informational footprint, I guess? By the way, I want to remind participants, everyone in the audience, please, if you have any questions or thoughts or observations, comments, put them into the Q&A, because we'd love to have you enter into the conversation with us as well. I suppose, it's interesting. You talked about this idea of a holobiont or of the humans and the data ohm as sort of being in lockstep with one another, but not necessarily completely sharing the same goals. And that's kind of freaky to think of the data ohm as something that might have goals or needs or desires or values that are different from the human values, or something that could sort of that we've helped create, and then it can sort of escape from us in some way. But I suppose, in thinking about these larger issues of climate change and keeping the Earth in sort of a healthy zone for life, that it would not be in the interest of the data ohm probably for us to experience something really catastrophic, just in the way that a virus doesn't want to kill off its host. So I guess unless you went to some really dystopian future where the data ohm decided it didn't need us anymore because we had just been a phase of creating the whatever comes after us. But I think I like the image that we share an interest, I suppose, with the data ohm of keeping humans basically within a safe what some environmentalists call the sort of safe operating range for humanity, because that would also allow the systems that are creating all this information to thrive. So maybe there's a sort of reassuring thought there that the data ohm does not have an interest in us not having a future that's good for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, it's as you said, in symbiotic relationships, there's still a benefit to being together. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing about it, right? There's still a net benefit, even if the interests of each other are slightly different. And so there's only so far you can push the other, right? Or only so far you can take the other. I mean, on a sort of rather unnerving end of this, and I'll mention something more positive, is, for the point of view of the data ohm, what would be the optimal kind of human existence? It might not be what we have today, or what many of us are lucky enough to have today. Obviously, we don't all have it. And that's actually another aspect of this that is interesting, that, roughly half of the human population does not have access to anything like high-speed internet. Roughly 3.8 billion people don't have that. And something like 20% of human adults are functionally illiterate around the globe. And their interaction, their engagement with the data is going to be quite different than for many of us. They're just not going to have the same kind of relationship. But the interesting thing is, from the perspective of the data, what's best? What would still be, mutually helpful, or at least, ensure the survival of both, but, better for the data ohm than for us. And it's, we get into the sort of matrix scheme there, where we're all just in a vat and, doing stuff for the data ohm. But so there's a hopeful side to that, right? That if the data ohm is coexisting with us and its interests in the Darwinian sense are survival, there's only so bad that things could possibly get before there'll be some kind of corrective thing going on, because that's kind of how Darwinian evolution works, unless you're unfortunate enough to swing into extinction. But that takes a lot. And one thing I talk about in the book as well, trying to sound a more hopeful note, is that humans are spectacular novelty generators, right? We are creative, right? We can produce ideas seemingly out of thin air. And that's something that we've yet to accomplish with any of our machines. Machine learning, AI, it's kind of one of the big open problems, grand challenges. It's been called the problem of open-endedness. And effort has gone in to doing that, to have algorithms that can actually be genuinely creative. And of course, we do have machine learning systems now that can produce things that kind of look like literature. There's a thing called GPT-3, an algorithm that has a lot of people terrified because it can generate, and it has basically absorbed an enormous amount of information from literature and writing, understanding the context and the way language is assembled. It can generate stuff that reads almost like a human would write it. And it's pretty astonishing. But when you do really look at that kind of output, it still falls short. It's like someone who's drunk too much and is just rambling on, but it sort of sounds coherent, and our tendency is to bring coherence to stuff that isn't coherent in our own brains. But in computation, this remains an unsolved issue. In some ways, perhaps we should be thankful it's unsolved, that no kind of computational system, algorithm, or machine learning is yet capable of this open-endedness, of generating endless novelty, and not just solving problems, but actually inventing the next problem to solve. And humans are really good at that. We do that all the time, not just in science, but in our whole lives. So the hopeful end of this is perhaps that is an essence that the datum is going to have to sustain. It needs that to be around, but it can't do it itself. And so maybe we'll be preserved for one of the few things that is actually unique to us and special to us. Sort of a hope. I mean, we might, you could still be in a vat somewhere, but I suspect that you can't be endlessly creative if that's the case. You need sensory input. You need to be active. You need to be out in the world. So there's a hopeful side to this, that the datatome won't absorb us and it won't do away with us, because we have certain qualities that it may never get.
Yeah, I like that that vision much better, that it actually wants to keep around for our creative input, rather than the matrix vision where we're basically just being used to generate energy. So
that's right.
In the final part of your book, in the closing chapter, you get into some really far out ideas, kind of taking this idea of the dataome to some of its logical conclusions in the rest of the universe and in the far future and so forth. And one thing you talk about is, that this is something that's, a phenomenon that is perhaps and perhaps almost surely not limited to Earth, and that you could imagine a universe full of dataomes and different stages of development, so forth, exodataomes or whatever, and that's a very intriguing thought, and it made me wonder, if SETI does succeed, if we succeed in exchanging messages, and then hopefully they won't just be cat videos, right? That we get. Wouldn't that be ironic?
You never know.
We get to see what alien cats look like, but no. But if that would basically be an exchange of information with other dataomes, and if there's sufficient exchange of information, I mean, in SETI sometimes people talk about like a galactic club, or this idea that there's a lot of civilizations that have ultimately found each other. So if that's happening and there's exchanges of information, then indeed would that be sort of a merging of the dataomes? And can you imagine not just it being a like sort of a planetary scale phenomena, but could there be like a galactic data ohm?
Yeah, fabulous idea. Yeah, so I mean that's a really interesting subject, and yeah, so the extraordinary thing about that, yeah. So as you were talking, I think yeah, I mean it's kind of like different data ohms can inoculate each other, right? They can exchange sort of essential bits and pieces and incorporate that into themselves. And the thing is, from what we understand of physics, physically moving around the universe is difficult, right? Maybe there are tricks and technologies that we're yet to discover that would enable that. But certainly for us right now and for our biological forms, going to the stars, pretty challenging. But sending signals, and something that SETI studies, not so challenging. And the data ohm doesn't care what it's built out of. That's one of the aspects of it. And so if it's built out of radio signals in a transmission between worlds, sure, great. And then, yeah, it can quite readily insinuate, one data ohm can insinuate itself into another. And as you say, one possible outcome of that, it feels a lot like what we think has happened here on Earth in horizontal gene transfer, right? So microbial organisms, and actually we're starting to look like even larger organisms do this at some level, can actually exchange snippets of the genetic code. It's like, hey, here's something useful, take that, okay? And bacteria and other single-celled organisms, archaea, seem to have done this throughout the last 4 billion years on Earth. That exactly parallels what you were talking about with data ohms. And so then you might still have somewhat distinct species of data ohm, but they may all end up related. So you could have a galaxy-wide population of data ohms that in the end are related, even though they have certain distinctions, which is a truly fascinating, extraordinary idea. And then the corollary to that is that if all data ohms are actively in symbiotic relationships with other kinds of life, like biological life, any modification to the data ohm at some point is going to modify the biological life. And so it might not happen right away, but suppose SETI is successful and we start exchanging information with an alien civilization somewhere else in the galaxy. Fascinating. We'd all be so excited we wouldn't sleep, as scientists, and it would be wonderful. But you kind of wonder, okay, a century later, you're going to suddenly say, humans feel a little different than they used to. I wonder what's been going on. And somewhere else in the galaxy, some other species going, we're not quite what we were before we contacted that other. So what's going on? So it's conceivable, and if you understood the data ohm, you might see this coming, that sort of the data ohm is a gateway to actually beginning a modification and evolution of the biological side of that symbiotic relationship. Very, very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before, but it's sort of an exciting and slightly terrifying idea.
Well, I love the idea of thinking of it as a horizontal gene transfer. That if our data ohm and their data ohms are like cells, and you start sending bits of information to each other, then you're all going to be altered. But another possibility then is that there already is a connected galactic data ohm out there, and then that means that if we succeed in making contact, we're not just contacting a society, then we're having the opportunity for better or worse to merge with the galactic data ohm.
Yeah. Which I've never heard anyone really sort of articulate. Right? People worry about protocols for making contact, and what should we do to be cautious and so on. This picture kind of ramps that up and says, actually, you've got to be really cautious. It may all look innocent, so maybe you exchange recipes for, new ways to make energy or something. Fantastic. But that in the end must have, in a Darwinian sense, exert some new kind of pressure on you as a biological species. So actually that first contact, it'll be too late. It's like
Yeah.
touching the contaminated surface. Whoop, okay. You know,
I mean,
you're
it's a
one
common
enough.
theme. It's a common theme a lot of us have had of the notion that contact in some ways would transform us. And a lot of times that's put in a very hopeful way. And I've been guilty of that too, of thinking, well, that would, be what we need to unite as a species and, childhood's end and all that. But it's a little unnerving to think that, yeah, you might be sort of turning on a process that then you couldn't turn off that's going to transform us in some way we totally couldn't predict. There are some audience questions here, so maybe we should take a few of those now. Somebody asks, can you talk more about the consumption of data on young, still maturing minds? Since our children are now walking around with computers in their pockets, how are the choices they're making affecting them?
Wow, that's an interesting question. It's somewhat outside of my expertise, so I hesitate to be too certain about anything I say, or to say too much about it. But I mean, I can't answer that question directly because it's outside my expertise, but I can tell you something else about actually changes to adult minds. And it's even nothing to do with smartphones and computers. So there's been some extraordinary studies done, and again, I talk about this in the book a little bit, on the difference between literate human minds and illiterate human minds. And so you can take a cohort of adults who, for whatever reasons of circumstance, never learned to read, never learned to decode symbols on a page. And some studies have been done where groups of people have been taken, they've agreed to do this, they've had their brains scanned with MRI scanners before and after learning to read, before and after becoming literate. And the remarkable thing is there are clearly observable structural changes to their brains, not just in sort of the outer part of the brain, the cortex, where a lot of stuff happens in the brain, but in deep, sort of evolutionarily old parts of the brain, like the thalamus and the brainstem. There are structural changes there thought to be to do with the changes necessary in our visual processing ability. So reading, becoming literate, is a very, very visual thing. It's all about decoding these symbols. But again, from the perspective of the dataome, that's really, really interesting. The dataome has kind of reached in and it's evolved our brains in a way that is independent of our genes, right? That's evolution in our brains that takes place way after we've been born. I mean, in that sense, it's not so different than all the other things that are going on in our brain. But the point is, you can function as a perfectly normal human being without being literate. And then this act of becoming literate really changes your brain. So what I would speculate is that there are probably going to be some structural differences between young people who spend all their time with devices. I mean, my children, they're now late teenagers. They've done this a lot of their lives. Interesting thing is I don't see obvious differences. And one of the most striking things, I teach at Columbia. I once asked a freshman class who were all sitting there on their smartphones while they were meant to be listening to me. And I asked them, so, do you feel out of control with this? And the interesting thing was that they said, no, not at all. And part of what they said was, no, we think we're much better than you old guys, you old folk, at sifting through all of this stuff and just ignoring the stuff that, we don't want to engage with. The advertisements, the pop-ups, the notifications, so on. We feel that we're really good at just ignoring all of that. And that, to me, it's unscientific to say this, it's anecdotal, was kind of striking that actually, perhaps, there are changes in young brains that enable them to navigate all of this better than those of us who didn't experience this when we were younger.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we hear a lot about kids growing up now as digital natives or whatever. And I suppose, you could say, well, that's because they're sort of being assimilated into the dataome. But you might also just say, as you really just implied, that what's happening is they're growing up better equipped to navigate the dataome than we were, because we didn't learn how to do all that stuff when we were young and our minds were more
right.
adaptable.
And it's also, and in some ways, you might expect that because for this symbiosis to work, it can't get too off balance. And so, it could be that a entirely natural sort of response from the biological side is to actually be better at sifting through stuff. You're still participating in the growth because, you keep adding and adding and adding, but you're not being swayed or diverted in a way that would be truly detrimental.
So we have somebody who earlier typed in, what did you come across in your research that felt hopeful? But then after one of your earlier answers, they amended that and they said, okay, you answered my question about hopefulness. So what scares you about our consumption of data?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that might scare me is that, again, in looking at this through the lens of sort of Darwinian evolution, equilibrium can be a movable thing, right? Equilibrium can be quite dynamic, and and that can be dangerous. It is clear right now because of change to we're losing species, right? Biodiversity is diminishing apart from changes to the physical environment and so on. And that's a sign of disequilibrium. So I think one of my concerns would be that we don't know what will get invented in the future. So we talked about, algorithms that can reproduce human literature or try to, and other things. We don't know what the next big thing will be. We worry about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram generate enormous amounts of data, adding to the data, adding to the burden on us in terms of resources and energy supply. Nothing is ever certain in evolution, right? There may be an innovation around the corner that screws this all up, right? And it will come from something that might seem kind of innocent. It'll be some new company emerges. It's like, oh, okay, you've got to have this app on your phone, right? And it turns out that it's going to swamp everything and push us in a direction that is truly detrimental. And the data might not be able to modify itself in Darwinian sense to save us, and therefore everything goes extinct. That I think is a concern, right? Everything I've been talking about is a survey of what's happening right now. But you constantly see innovations in biology, and we constantly see innovations in the informational world. Who knows what's next? Maybe it's already out there, right? Some obscure app from some obscure company that's going to suddenly be on all of our phones and actually drive us even faster to a very unstable point.
It's a little unnerving.
Good question.
Yeah. I do like the image of the data ohm at least sort of trying to preserve itself, and therefore us sort of going along for that ride. So there's another question that we touched on a little bit, but it's nicely worded, and I know there's a lot more to say. So this person says, pardon my abject ignorance of physical principles. It's okay, you're pardoned. But would it ever be possible for our information to escape our planet in any organized way?
Interesting question. I mean, some of this relates to what we were talking about with SETI and communicating. I mean, we transmit information all the time, and of course, we've been doing some of that since we had radios and TV. Some of that data, that sort of structured electromagnetic radiation, is still sweeping out into the universe. I mean, it gets weaker as it goes along, but it's still sweeping out into the universe. So in piecemeal, I would say that that's already happened and is happening. Even when we send a spacecraft to Mars, or I know David is part of sending things to Venus, right? He's very excited because finally we're going to go back to Venus. It's amazing, with not just one, but I think 3 planned missions. What's a spacecraft? What's a robotic explorer? Well, it will have big elements of the data ohm in it, and just encoded in its physical structure, coded its microprocessors will be communicating with those things and so on. So I think it's easy to leak a data ohm out into the universe. Letting the whole data ohm escape and go somewhere else, I don't know. I mean, in principle, right, you could accumulate all of the information of data ohm, put it on some kind of fantastical hard drive and either transmit it or send it out into the universe as a complete recording of everything at this instant. But I think that would have to happen deliberately at this point. And total escape also, if a data ohm requires its biological partner, it might not work until it found some other biological partner. So maybe that would be another way to do this. So if an alien hard drive drops on the planet, don't plug it in because it will be an alien data ohm that's just looking for another symbiote in us.
Well, we're almost out of time. We just have a couple more minutes, but there's a question that just popped up that's, well, it's really interesting, and I'm sure you could give a long answer, but I'm going to challenge you now to give a short answer because we just have a couple more minutes. And the question is, Walter Ong wrote, I hope I'm saying that right, wrote about the transition from oral knowledge or myth to written knowledge, logos or logic, and a new or different way of thinking. How does the data ohm change human thinking?
Well, so a very quick answer to that, I think, would be that actually, in some ways, we don't know what human thinking would be like without a data ohm. Because part of what I'm saying is we've really always had it, and that's part of what makes us Homo sapiens. It may have been much simpler and smaller originally, but clearly, we've used language and even symbolic representation. We've made tools for a very, very long time, potentially even further back, species prior to us. So, without the data ohm, I don't know if we would be human, in fact. That's kind of a weaselly answer to your question, which is a great question, but, in the interest of time, that's my kind of speedy answer.
Great.
I didn't know. Are you ready for me to come back?
Yeah.
Well, I think I speak for everybody when I wish we had more time. This has been such a lovely conversation. Thank you both so much. I have enjoyed every minute of it. I want to thank everybody out there for joining us on Zoom. As a gentle reminder, I've put the link to purchase the Ascent of Information books, Bits, Genes, Machines, and Life's Unending Algorithm. It's in the chat. While you're on the Politics and Prose website, check out the events page. We hope to see you all at another event soon. And in the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks very much.